Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Pass Meets Profit. Today we're going to be talking about Brandenburg and eventually Prussia from 30 Years' War to um, the 7 Years' War. Let's just get right into it. First off, let's just talk about what the 30 Years' War is. Just a very brief summary because it's kind of impossible to go into without its own separate video. But 30 Years' War can be defined by four phases. The first phase being the Bohemian phase. This is it's triggered by the defenestration of Prague in 1618, which is when it's a funny story. Two Protestant nobles threw um, the an official of the emperor out of the castle window, but the official survived, and he goes back to Vienna. He goes back to the capital of the emperor, the Austrian Habsburgs, and he tells them what happened, and everyone's just pissed because the emperor just had oh basically one of his workers thrown out of a building. The official got thrown out of a building, and the nobles threw a guy out of the building, and he lived. Which so everyone's pissed off. But back to get off the tangent. Eventually, this led to the Protestants revolting against Catholic rule, or the Bohemian Protestants revolting against Catholic rule, and the Austrians stepping in and suppressing this revolt, which led to more centralized control of the province of Bohemia by the Austrians, and this led to very some harsh recatholicization policies. Now, this pissed off Protestants both within the empire and beyond. Specifically, um, the Danes, who consider themselves the protector of Protestants in Europe, were very pissed off by this, and they intervened to protect the Protestants and to expand their own influence in the region. However, they were pretty like they were handled without too much difficulty by the Austrians, and all the really Danes served to do was two things. First, the Edict of Restitution, which basically just destroyed 100 years of progress by the Protestants. That was very bad. However, it did lead to the Swedes, under Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, coming in and stepping into the place of the Danish as protector of Protestants. And the Swedes were able to have a lot of success, mainly due to the military genius of Gustavus Adolphus. However, Gustavus Adolphus dies at Lutzen in 1632, and the Swedes stall out. They remain active in the war, but their progress is pretty much halted. Now, with the Danes defeated, the Swedes halted. It looks like it's going to end up being a stalemate or even another Habsburg victory. However, this is when France joins. Say Habsburg, not Catholic, because France is Catholic, and they're not going after uh, the Austrians or the Habsburgs because they're fighting Spain too. Um, they're not going after them because of any religious means, but rather political, as they were strong rivals of the Habsburgs. And similar to Sweden, France comes in. They very strong nation. They have a lot of success against both the Austrian and Spanish Habsburgs, but they eventually stall out. And all this is really doing is creating a lot of devastation, which really and a lot of war fatigue, which led to although there being no clear victor, there led to being the Peace of Westphalia, which created religious peace in the empire. However, also just completely destroyed the influence of the emperor over the empire. Why? Each prince was able to have control of the religion in their own domain, which sent the president that the prince has complete control over their domain, and that the emperor cannot have any stake in that land. Now let's focus on Brandenburg during this. Um, Brandenburg was politically a or religiously a Protestant nation, but politically they were an elector, which gave them strong ties to Austria. This situation made um this put them in a very sticky situation. They tried staying out of the war, as picking either side would mean abandoning the other. However, due to their geographic location and the fact that they were a Protestant nation, simply due to that, geographically they were on the northern part of the empire, right in the path of where the Austrians, the Danes, and the Swedes would meet. What this led to is very much Brandenburg becoming a battleground and just becoming a place where their land would be sacked and devastated by the armies of the area. Um, why? Because and why did the Brandenburgs why did Brandenburg allow this to happen? Because they couldn't do anything to stop it. They had no they couldn't they weren't in a state of war, so they couldn't raise levies, and they had no standing army to combat this. Now this leads us into Frederick William, considered the great elector. Um, he did a much better job than his predecessor in um, balancing balancing the which side he towed to, and he was able to have some small benefits in this in acquiring East Pomerania, which gave them access to the Baltic Sea. Um, he very much learned from this war, and he learned that Brandenburg required a permanent standing army to defend them from foreign armies coming in and destroying their land. Now, let's talk about Brandenburg's economy during the war, and directly after. Like I said, there's it being a battleground. There's huge devastation. Around half the population died because of this, due to the war or byproducts of it. Um, you lose half the population. There's farms that go untilled, livestock that's either taken or they die as well. There's not enough people to actually uphold the infrastructure, and because of that, rivers, roads, mills all fall into disrepair, and all this led to food shortages because not only is there not enough food production, there's also the food's also being taken by armies passing through and fighting there. Now, with agriculture being the backbone of Brandenburg's economy, the Brandenburgian economy collapsed. However, there wasn't just population loss and agricultural devastation. There was also a huge rollback in uh, urban centers, towns, urban centers such as Berlin, Frankfurt on den Oder, Brandenburg on den Havel, all shrank significantly. Why? Because the trade was very much disrupted by the war. What does this mean? Manufacturers within these urban centers had nowhere could not export their goods. The merchants themselves could not trade and make a living off that. And again, the ruined infrastructure just made the problem worse, as there's no road. You couldn't safely travel on roads or by sea because rivers and roads were all just fell into disrepair. Now, from a purely government revenue standpoint, this is a harsh truth. You lose half your population. You lose the tax revenue from half that population, which was so you big loss of revenue there. And then there are a lot of debts that had to be taken on by basically Brandenburg paying bribes so they wouldn't be completely destroyed. Now, how do they rebuild from this? They were rock bottom. How do they rebuild? First, they play to their strengths. They rebuild their agriculture. They get immigrants to come in and take over these lands, and they drain marshlands to create more land for to create an agricultural base. And they also granted a lot of privileges, specifically tax privileges, to the nobility in order to speed up this process. This uh, completely revitalized the agricultural output, which um, which would be vital later down the line. Second thing they did was decentralizing state finances. Uh, they created the General War Commissariat. Now, this was necessary to um, maintain the now new standing army. So, what did the Commissariat do? They managed taxation and military spending. The Brandenburg, the whole, the leaders of Brandenburg also established more direct control over their own finances, and this had the byproduct of reducing the independent fiscal power of noble estates. Basically, the nobles could not spend state money anymore. Um, Now they use these strengths to they use their agriculture the revitalization of their agricultural economy to then push themselves in a better position industrially. They encouraged textile and weaving industries, brought in the skills of those immigrants to do that. In a similar manner, they adopted Dutch mercantile practices, and they developed their new. They took advantage of their access to the sea to develop port activity. Now, what did this ultimately lead to? What did this rebuilding and advancing eventually lead to? Well, the first major change was that Prussia was no longer just an electorate within the Holy Roman Empire; they became a kingdom. Frederick the First was able to crown himself king in Prussia, so there's a lot of prestige going on there. When was at home, but as a king, there also now became a lot more court expenses, um, to build up the prestige of this now new kingdom. They um he commissioned all the arts and sciences. He created the Academy of the Sciences, which in all this there was a lot of it was very costly, but it did pay dividends that towards the end. However, this state of large military spending or large court spending only lasted under Frederick the First, as once you as his son Frederick William the First laid the groundwork that would eventually allow Frederick the Great to do what he did. Frederick William, he was able to very much focus on really just the economy and the military. So where this lead to? It led to a very frugal state. It cut back court spending by almost 75%. The bureaucracy became very efficient. If the office wasn't needed, it was removed. If someone wasn't needed, they were taken out of the bureaucracy. And what this did, again, it made it a lot more efficient and removed a lot of the corruption within the bureaucracy. Um, they now, Roger William used these newfound surpluses to then fund his army and everything that goes into it. He grew his army to over 80,000 men, basically giving it 80,000 jobs. And he used the surpluses to promote the production of an arms industry, ironworks for munitions and gear, so things of that nature. Now, this led to William Frederick the Great. What did Frederick the Great do? His greatest achievement was the acquisition of Silesia, which was able to increase the the population and tax base of Prussia by one third. But however, on top of this, he continued the reforms of his father, legally, bureaucratically, and economically, improved infrastructure, um, and he made a lot of judicial reforms, both in codifying the laws of Brandenburg, as well as just very strict judicial reforms to aid in the reduction of corruption. Now, this is a great story. Brandenburg, a very small state that's completely devastated, is able to come out of this situation, become stronger. They're able to go toe to toe with the emperor himself and acquire land again and make them stronger. But what can we learn from Prussia in this? First thing that we can learn is when we go back to how they rebuilt. They were a very agrarian. Their economy was very based in agriculture. And instead of strictly abandoning that, they used it. They built up their agriculture, they rebuilt it, and they expanded it. However, they weren't blind to this. They weren't. They knew. They saw what the future was, and they invested. They invested in manufacturing, both. And so you see this in textile manufacturing, as well as their uh ironworks. Again, when we talk mission and equipment foundries. Um, what this did is that it put in an economic base that could be built on in later years, and that so that when the time came, they weren't strictly reliant on agriculture. Last but not least, they were very aggressive. They and everything had a use. Textile manufacturers put clothes on the shoulders' backs. The ammunition for guns and ammo, for equipment to protect the soldiers. What this led to a very strong military state that can go out and conquer and take over. They're aggressive in what they did. They're aggressive in taking advantage of the opportunity in front of them to benefit themselves. In the same way, we should play to our strengths. If you're good at math, don't abandon that. Um, if you're good at writing, don't abandon that either. Play to that strength, but use that strength to then bring up your weaknesses. It's a very compounding effect, and that's what they did. They were able to use their strengths to build up their weakness, their strength in agriculture, to build up their weakness in manufacturing, which then was able to provide for an army that can go out and conquer. We should find our find what your strength is, build that up, then use your strength, build up one of your weaknesses, make it your strength. Secondly, take advantage of your opportunities and attack them. Don't if you see an opportunity, don't wait for it to come to you. You go to it. You don't let it pass by. And in that way, you'll be able to succeed. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.